There is a voice inside your head right now. It's narrating this sentence. It commented on the last thing you ate. It rehearsed that conversation you had 3 days ago, the one that went wrong, and it rewrote the ending over and over again. And here's what nobody tells you. That voice, it isn't you. For most of human history, people who heard voices in their heads were considered either divine or insane. The ancient Greeks believed internal voices were messages from the gods. The Egyptians called it the voice of the soul. Medieval physicians called it a symptom of possession. And for centuries, people quietly endured these conversations inside themselves, terrified to admit what was happening. Then science caught up, and what it found was stranger than anything the mystics had imagined. Psychologists started studying something they called inner speech, the silent monologue running inside the human mind almost every waking hour. Not a disorder, not a spiritual gift, something far more universal and far more disturbing. They found that the average person spends roughly 70% of their waking life engaged in some form of internal conversation. 70%. You are almost never truly silent. Even when you say nothing, a voice is speaking. And science has now started asking the question almost no one wants to answer. Who is that voice actually talking to? Here's where it starts to get unsettling. When you talk to yourself, really talk, the kind where you say, okay, you need to calm down, or what were you thinking? You instinctively switch pronouns. You stop saying I. You start saying you. Psychologists call this distanced self-talk, and for years it seemed like a quirk, a strange verbal habit with no deeper meaning. But then, researchers at the University of Michigan ran a series of experiments, and the results forced them to rethink something fundamental about human consciousness. When people used their own name, moments when they said, Ahmad, stop panicking, instead of I need to stop panicking, their emotional regulation measurably improved. Their cortisol dropped. Their performance on stressful tasks increased. They made better decisions. They recovered from failure faster. Not because of what they said, because of how they said it. As if something inside the brain responds better to being spoken to as a separate person. Let that land. Your own mind works better when you treat yourself like a stranger. But that wasn't the strangest part. Neuroscientists started mapping what actually happens in the brain during inner speech, and what they found broke several assumptions about selfhood entirely. When you think in words, when that inner voice runs, your brain activates a region called Broca's area, the same region that fires when you hear someone else speaking, not just when you produce language, when you receive it. Your brain, on some level, experiences your own inner voice as if it were coming from outside of you. You are speaker and audience simultaneously, narrator and character, the one telling the story and the one the story is being told to. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Psychologists now believe the inner voice isn't a unified narrator. It's a chorus, a cast of characters, a rotating panel of identities. The critic, the protector, the child, the cynic, all running on the same hardware, all competing for the microphone. And most of us have no idea this is happening. We think we have one self. We might have dozens. For most people, the inner voice is a companion. For some, it becomes a warden. Clinical psychologists have long known that in disorders like severe depression and anxiety, the inner voice doesn't just narrate, it prosecutes. It replays the worst moments. It predicts failure. It delivers verdicts before the trial begins. But here's the disturbing implication. Research now suggests this isn't a malfunction. It's an exaggeration. The same mechanism that creates the helpful inner coach, the voice that says you've got this before a job interview, is the same mechanism that, under the wrong conditions, becomes the voice that says you were never good enough to begin with. They aren't different systems. They're the same voice in a different mood. And this raises a question that should stop you cold. If you can't always trust the voice in your head, and you can't always locate where it's coming from, how do you know which version of it is telling the truth? Here's where the story changes. We've been treating this as a psychological phenomenon, a quirk of cognition, a fascinating glitch in the brain software. But consider what it actually means. From the moment language entered the human brain, roughly 70,000 years ago, we became the only species on Earth that could narrate its own existence, the only animal that could construct a story about itself, play it back, revise it, and live inside it. That inner voice, isn't just a psychological curiosity. It is the engine of human identity. Every belief you hold about yourself was, at some point, narrated into you by your parents, by your culture, by the people who shaped your early life. You didn't choose the voice, you inherited it. And over decades, it became so fluent, so automatic, so seamlessly fused with your sense of self that you stopped noticing it was there. You started calling it yourself. But what if it isn't? What if the voice in your head is less like a soul and more like a script, written by people you can barely remember in a language you never chose, running on a loop so old you've mistaken it for instinct? This isn't a comforting thought, but it might be the most important one you've ever had. There's one more layer, and this one reaches all the way into the modern world. We live now in the most distracted era in human history. Notifications, feeds, streams of infinite content designed specifically to interrupt the silence. And researchers have begun to wonder whether there's something more than coincidence in that timing. Because silence, true silence, is where the inner voice gets loud. And loud means confrontational. In the quiet, the voice asks the questions we spend our waking hours running from. Am I living the life I wanted? Do the people I love actually know me? Have I been honest with myself about what I've become? Maybe we don't fear our inner voice because it's broken. Maybe we fear it because underneath all the noise, it's the only part of us that still tells the truth. So the next time you catch yourself talking to yourself, narrating the drive home, rehearsing a conversation that already ended, saying your own name in the dark of 3 a.m., don't dismiss it. Don't call it strange, because it isn't a malfunction. It's something profoundly human, an ancient technology built into the architecture of consciousness itself, a voice that has been speaking since before language had a name for what it was doing. The question was never why do you talk to yourself? The question is whether you've been brave enough to listen, and whether, when you finally do go quiet enough to hear what it's actually saying, you'll be ready for the answer.